A wedding is usually a joyful day for a bride. However, a century ago, a royal bride experienced a wedding that could only be described as horrifying. She nearly lost her life. She was Victoria Eugenie, the former Queen of Spain and grandmother of former King Juan Carlos. Her family used to call her Ana. On May 31, 1906, Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg walked into the Church of Saint Jerome the Royal in Madrid. After saying "I do" to King Alfonso XIII of Spain, she left the church as Queen of Spain. However, on the couple's way back to the royal palace, their procession was attacked by an anarchist named Mateo Morral. From a fourth-floor balcony, he threw a bomb disguised as a bouquet at their carriage in an attempt to assassinate them. The homemade bomb failed to hit its target directly, as it struck an overhead tram cable. Even so, it caused devastating damage. 24 people were killed, including members of the Royal Guard and bystanders, among them the Marchioness of Tolosa and her daughter, who were watching from a nearby balcony. More than 100 others were injured. The king, queen, and the guards in the carriage were unharmed. The king's order of the golden fleece necklace was broken, and his uniform was torn in the chest. Bomb fragments entered the carriage and embedded themselves in the seats. After a delay caused by the chaos, the king and queen switched carriages and continued to the palace. They appeared several times on the balcony to the cheers of the crowd. When the queen emerged, her gown was still stained with blood from the attack. As if it were an omen, Ana's marriage would also be marked by misfortune. On October 24, 1887, Ana was born at Balmoral Castle as the only daughter of Princess Beatrice, the youngest child of Queen Victoria, and Prince Henry of Battenberg. At her baptism, she was given the name Victoria Eugenie Julia Ana. Victoria honored her grandmother, while Eugenie came from her godmother, Empress Eugenie of France. In what seemed like a fateful parallel, Ana would later share a destiny similar to her godmother's. Although Empress Eugenie did not attend Ana's christening, she was represented by Princess Frederica of Hanover. Eugenie, then living in exile in Britain, often spent time with members of the British royal family, and Ana frequently stayed with her grandmother, Queen Victoria, so it is very likely that Ana encountered her godmother during her childhood. Queen Victoria had once hoped that her youngest daughter, Ana's mother, would remain unmarried and stay by her side for life. However, Princess Beatrice had other plans. The compromise eventually reached was that, upon marriage, Beatrice and her husband would continue to live with Queen Victoria. This meant that their children would be raised in their grandmother's household. Ana's childhood was filled with misfortune. When she was 9 years old, her father died of malaria while serving in Africa. Prince Henry of Battenberg had longed to travel to West Africa and explore the unknown. This thirst for new experiences was reflected nearly a decade after he died in the actions of his only daughter. Despite opposition from many, Ana later decided to accept the proposal of the King of Spain. In 1905, King Alfonso XIII of Spain made an official state visit to the United Kingdom. By then, Queen Victoria had passed away, and Ana's uncle, King Edward VII, hosted a banquet at Buckingham Palace in honor of the Spanish king. It was at this dinner that Ana met her future husband. After returning to Spain, Alfonso XIII fell deeply in love with Ana and vowed to marry no one else. However, his mother, Queen Maria Cristina, disapproved of her son's choice. On one hand, she believed the Battenberg family was not truly royal because Prince Henry of Battenberg's mother's origins were unclear. On the other hand, she wanted her son to marry someone from her own family, the Habsburgs. Additionally, because Ana was a descendant of Queen Victoria, there was a potential risk of hemophilia. Her brother Leopold was a hemophiliac, so Ana had a 50% chance of being a carrier, though the degree of risk was uncertain. If Alfonso married her, their children might be affected by the disease. Despite all this, Alfonso did not hesitate. Rumors about which Princess Alfonso would marry persisted for a year. Finally, in January 1906, his mother gave her consent to her son's choice and wrote a letter to Ana's mother expressing Alfonso's love for her daughter and seeking informal contact with the king. A few days later, King Edward congratulated his niece on her upcoming engagement at Windsor. In early 1906, Anna traveled to Spain, converted to Catholicism, and married her king. This marriage was far from a fairy tale and was filled with various misfortunes. Because Anna had a difficult start as Queen of Spain, she became estranged from the Spanish people and was unpopular in her new land. Her situation began to improve after giving birth to her eldest son and heir to the throne, Prince Alfonso of Asturias. However, during a circumcision procedure on the young prince, doctors noticed he was bleeding excessively, an early sign that the infant heir had hemophilia. Anna was the source of the disease. Her youngest son was later confirmed to have inherited it, while Anna's second son, Prince Jamie, became deaf at the age of 4. Alfonso XIII blamed all these misfortunes on Anna. Reportedly, he never forgave his wife or accepted what had happened, and began to have frequent affairs. Alfonso XIII and Anna had 7 children in total, 5 sons and 2 daughters. Fortunately, their daughters were never diagnosed as carriers of hemophilia. Anna raised her children amid an increasingly fragile and tense political environment, as her husband supported an unpopular war to retain Spain's territories in Africa. In 1923, with King Alfonso's backing, Army General Miguel Primo de Rivera established a dictatorship. After Rivera's fall in 1930, the king became even more unpopular. In April 1931, following the Republican coalition's election victory, Alfonso left Spain. Alfonso XIII and his family went into exile abroad, and his relationship with his wife completely broke down. During their exile, they essentially led separate lives. In 1934, their youngest son Gonzalo died from bleeding after what seemed to be a minor car accident. 4 years later, Anna's eldest son also died under similar circumstances. By the time her husband passed away in 1941, Anna and he were like strangers to each other, and she lived alone for the following decades. Despite living in exile abroad, Anna's ties with royalty grew closer in her later years. In 1956, when Hollywood legend Grace Kelly married Prince Rainier III of Monaco, it was Queen Anna who offered support and guidance to the new royal member, helping her begin her life as a princess. Several photographs from Anna's later years show her holding hands with Grace. The Princess of Monaco held her friend in high regard and even invited her to be the godmother of her son, Albert, in 1958. After her exile ended, Anna returned to Spain only once. She arrived in Madrid in February 1968 and soon became the godmother of her newly born great-grandson, Felipe. In a famous baptism photo, he is seen lying in Queen Anna's arms. 7 years later, after Franco's death, the Spanish monarchy was restored. On June 19, 2014, King Juan Carlos abdicated, and Felipe ascended the throne as the new King of Spain. But Anna never lived to see the troubled crown, which had played such an important role in her life, restored to new glory. She passed away on April 15, 1969, the 38th anniversary of her escape from Spain. Her funeral was held in Lausanne, where she was buried. However, Anna's story did not end there. 6 years after her death, the Spanish monarchy was restored. In 1985, her grandson King Juan Carlos I had her remains moved to the royal crypt in El Escorial, on the outskirts of Madrid. She was laid to rest beside her husband and 3 sons who had predeceased her. 8 years later, her other son Juan was also buried there. Anna, the youngest granddaughter of Queen Victoria, lived a life far less stable than her grandmother's. She served as Queen of Spain for 25 years but spent even more time in exile. Yet it was the personal tragedies in her life that seemed the hardest to bear. For this cherished jewel of the family, life was far from a royal fairy tale.